Good afternoon, everyone, again, and welcome to our Pan lecture series. This afternoon, we have a pleasure of introducing Dr. Lawrence, and he will be talking about siege, tales of courage and defiance. Dr. Korchnak has been a longtime member of the Pan organization. He's written several books. He is well-renowned in this field, which is very specific and very unique. And it's a pleasure to have him as a member of PAN and a supporter of the hobby. I hope you enjoy his talk. Dr. Korchnak.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Thanks for those of you who take some time out from the show to come to the talk. This is about an area of passion for me. Recently, I published a book on siege coins, and part of that book and the reason for writing it was to create a context instead of just a list of coins. So this talk is predicated on the information that I put together, my narratives on the sieges that were in the book, which of course will be available over there at the John Burns Library. I have a few that if anyone's interested at that point. Now, to start off, this is called Siege Stories, Tales of Courage and Defiance. You need to know two things as we start. Number one, courage and defiance doesn't mean they won. In any type of battle, some people are courageous, some are defiant, some win, and some lose. So the stories go either way. Secondly, there are a whole lot more stories than I have time to tell. So I picked a bunch of the ones that I thought would be some of the most interesting. We start off with the Siege of Constantinople. And when Constantinople in 1453 was basically the Byzantine Empire. At that particular point, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk because of the Ottomans taking the grounds that surrounded the city. So Constantinople, by virtue of it being a fortress city, was the last bastion of the Byzantine Empire. And it was considered a prize by the Ottomans, Mehmed II. Now, Constantine knew he was under pressure, so the year before, in 1452, he made an overture towards the Roman Church. Constantinople and the Byzantine Church, having had the schism years before, 400 or 500 years before, they were not on good speaking terms, but he knew he needed support. So he made provisions to have the Latin Mass, not the Byzantine Rite Mass, in the cathedrals in Constantinople. The reason for that, he needed the Pope's armies and needed the Pope's navies. The church elders refused permission to have the Mass. Help never came. I tell you that because it would have been difficult enough to try to fight the Ottomans with the Pope's navies and armies, and it was even more difficult and unfortunately impossible without them. Turkish armies came to Constantinople on April 5, and they surrounded the city. If you've ever been to Istanbul, it sits on that point that sticks out, cut off by the walls built around it, and which is why it was virtually impregnable. The defenders then stretched chains around the city on the horn. The arrow that you see across there, the chain was down below. This is in a foreign language. It's hard to find good maps of Constantinople in English, so I pulled this off the internet. You see the chain where it says barriera, the barrier, and that big arrow overnight, Mehmed picked up 70 galleys, took them overland, and placed them in the water behind the barrier. And that's why you see the boats in the water in that middle area over there. That's how that comes. So that's where it was set up. Now, as they did that, you understand that Constantine XI, the last emperor of the Byzantine Empire, Constantine XI had a chance, if I would say, to buy a weapon that might have bought him some time. There was a Hungarian gunmaker named Orban, and he said that he can create a cannon that would outdo anything. That would have been the ultimate weapon, the nuclearization. That would be the analogy, the nuclear weapon of the period, this great cannon. And he went to Constantine and said, I can do this, but as all people, and if we talk sieges, sieges are fought by mercenaries at this time in history. And they had to be paid. So anybody who fought for money. If you were fighting in Constantinople, you might have, for example, a troop of Italians, a troop of Scottishmen, a troop of Dutchmen. They were mercenaries and they needed to be paid. And the people that made the weapons also needed to be paid. Constantine had no money. He couldn't pay for the cannon, so Orban went to Mehmed II. He went to Mehmed and said, I have this great weapon that can blow down the walls of Constantinople, the impregnable city, and I can prove it. He showed the gun to Mehmed, one shot. Mehmed said, I'll take it. He proceeded to build the largest cannon, and it took 6 weeks for that, 2.5 miles a day from the now city of Adrianople. It would be Edirne at that particular time. That's where Mehmed's troops were to try to come down so that they can attack. The cannon looks something like this. It would look like that. That is not the cannon, because the cannon eventually melted down from overuse during the war and exploded. At any rate, that's what they were. That's what the cannon were. But this was a huge one. And the large stones were like 1 to 2 tons. And that's what they needed to blast the walls. Understand that Mehmed did not want to take Constantinople by destroying the city. It was a pearl. It was a prize. He wanted to keep it intact. In fact, when he told the soldiers when they broke into it, he said, don't burn it down, don't do anything, you can loot, do whatever you want, keep the city intact, which is what they did. So, on May 29th, they filled the moats with corpses. Normal fighting, those who weren't the officers or had anything, most of the people that they took in their victories were slaves. They put them in the first line, and those first lines would fight. And because there were moats and there were places, siege works that were developed and defense works, the bodies would fill it, the moats, and that's when the high-level troops, the Janissaries in this case, would stomp over them. And that's what they did in the siege. So they came into the city completely. Constantine himself went to fight at the end of the war, at the end of the battle when they came in. They identified Constantine by his royal slippers. He was in a pile with the other dead. And Mehmed ultimately came through. Now, in 1988, a hoard of coins were discovered. Prior to 1988, there were only reports that there were coins struck during the siege of Constantinople. This was one of them. It's a silver coin, but it's a bit tarnished from my collection. And if you can see how crude it looks from your angle, the reason why is if you were a gun maker, you had skills in working with metal. And if you were a gun maker, you needed paid, like Orban needed to be paid for his cannon. Well, the fact of the matter is those people were bought by Mehmed and they made weapons for him. So at that point, they had nobody who was really skilled enough to make good-looking coins. And so on the coins you had on the right, that would be Constantine the 11th, and on the left would be Christ, the Pancreator. And that would be a coin. There are 50 of these known. This is the one in my collection. It's a rather fascinating story of the siege, and one of the first, I think, and so I spend a little more time on it. A second siege of interest is in Famagusta in 1570. The decline of Venetian influence in the Mediterranean region came in the 16th century. Lala Mustafa was then the head of the troops for the Ottomans, and he wanted to persuade the city to give up. However, the leader of the city, Marco Bragadin, did not want to, so they fought. Unfortunately, and I think you can see here in the picture, the terrain here is on sand. It's very loose soil. About 50 years earlier and 100 years earlier, 1650, in Malta, the Ottomans could not take the city because they couldn't tunnel into the rock. They could tunnel here, and they besieged that city with heavy bombardment. Finally, the city had to surrender. There was nothing left for them to do but surrender. You see they have them circumvented there on all sides, the armies, and then you have, of course, the navies in the water there. Well, after a very brutal time, Bragadin said, okay, I will surrender. Well, okay, they wanted to surrender. They set up terms. Most of these sieges end up in some type of honorable surrender, and that honorable surrender means you have to give up stuff. So they had to negotiate what they would and they would not do. They had worked that all out, but there was bad blood. On the day that they were to sign the negotiated surrender, something went wrong. History doesn't record what it is, but the bottom line is something went wrong. They didn't sign it. They grabbed Martin Bragadin, the general from Famagusta, and they killed him, cut him to pieces, and delivered his pieces to the soldiers, to the Ottoman soldiers, and they came in and took the city. So his act of bravery wasn't much. He got what ended up to be the worst end of the bargain here. Another bad story about what happens in sieges. This is a coin from Byzante. It has a little 1, and the F down on the bottom means it's from Famagusta. It's an interesting coin, nice copper. In Haarlem, 1572, Haarlem civic pride didn't let them surrender, even though the odds, they had 4,000 people in the city, and there were 25,000 troops surrounding the city. It was doomed at the outset. And the reason why I want to tell this story is because the women of Haarlem played a very important role. Over 300 women stood with the men in defense of the cities. Nobody back then would sit back and wait. It was fighting for their lives and their honor. That's one of the ladies. That's a classic picture of it. One of the ladies, what they did is they had 2 sieges. In the first siege, these are the kind of coins they produced. 1 in silver there and one in tin. First siege, that's what happened in Haarlem. The Spanish general believed in a very strict form of autocracy. He thought that if he crushed them mercilessly, it would put fear into the hearts of the Dutch and they would surrender. It did the opposite. Down the road, this type of behavior on the part of the Spanish troops emboldened the Dutch to revolt, and in 80 years, it was an 80 years war, that's what happened. They finally won their independence. At any rate, in this siege, there was no honor. The surviving defenders here, 1,800 of them were marched into the public square, 600 were hanged, and others put to the sword. The remaining 1,200 were tied in pairs, and they were drowned in the harbor. The entire population was killed in the city, and virtually destroyed the city, including women and children. Alkmaar's a better story. In 1573, Don Federico, who was also fighting in Haarlem, hoped that that brutality would help him. And the citizens, however, realized that they couldn't surrender. If they were going to do that, they can't do it to us. We can't trust them. So they said, we're going to go out for the long haul. This particular city, and I will go to the end before the beginning, was really the first Dutch city to overcome a siege. And they did so because there was a group of mercenaries called the Beggars of the Sea Beggars. This particular guy, Cavalier, was the leader of the Sea Beggars. They had these small ships that they would go out and they would attack at whoever would pay them or whoever's side that they took. And that's what they did. And the Sea Beggars arrived. They were in dire straits. The commander of Alkmaar had so riled up, his people wanted to surrender, that he once stood in front of them and held his arm up and he said, if you're starving so much, because at that point of the siege they were eating the dogs, the cats, the rats, anything that was edible, and that's how you survived in long-term sieges. He said, take my arm, you can cut my arm off, and you could eat my arm. We want you to stay. Well, what happened was the beggars said they want to come and help. There wasn't enough for rain at that time of the season. So they requested from William Orange that he could open up a few of the dikes and drown the area. So he puts the flood the area, and what they ended up doing is, as you can see around, water ended up surrounding the town, and it prevented the besiegers from being able to conduct their siege. And then that water allowed the sea beggars to come in and relieve the city. And so this one turned out okay for the Dutch. The first time that they overcame a siege by the Spanish, and that's in 1573. That's a coin from Alkmaar, 32 stiver coin, the city emblem. Very crudely struck. Most of them are because they were very emergency. They just grabbed pieces of metal, melted whatever they had to do, and put their stamps on it, put a denomination, and that was used to pay the troops. The next siege was Leiden, 1573 and 74. It was a city that was besieged twice, and the reason why I tell this story is because the Spanish erected things around the city and said, this is it, we're cutting you off, you're done, you have to surrender. Well, they didn't want to surrender, they wanted to fight. This was a siege that they made coins out of paper. They took hymnals and such, and they pasted the pages together, cut them out, and they stamped coins. So if you see that on the bottom, that's a coin. Now what is that? That was a split coin. What they did, it was a bookbinder who made the coins for them. And that was given permission. And this is strange because most sieges, they make silver and gold stuff first, and then they go to the weird stuff later. This time they made them out of paper because they didn't have enough gold and silver. Then what happened is there was another thing that caused the Spanish army to leave Leiden and take off, and they thought the siege was over. After the end of the siege, these are paper siege coins. You can see when they're not split. That's what the coin looked like. They made them look just like coins. And when the siege was done, people took the paper coins and turned them in for silver. And then they made real silver coins to pay them. And they thought everything was good. The only problem is Spanish came back, they went to fight, the fight went bad, they tried to get what they tried to get, and what happened is they came through, and as you can see, there's all kind of little ships. They did the same thing. At this particular time, William Orange Leiden was far inland, and one of the problems with Leiden was you had to open up a lot of dikes to let water in. Leaving the water in like that was pretty important, but what it also did was destroy the farming area. So they got special permission to open the dikes. They opened the dikes, and there still wasn't enough for the beggars to come in. And fortunately for the Dutch, there was a storm surge, brought water in, brought it enough for the boats to come in, and it saved the city. And at the end, you can see here is a famous picture in the Netherlands, where the beggars of the sea came in and gave relief to the citizens of Leiden. Interesting. Oudewater, 1575. Very long story short, this was one where the Spanish came into the city. The city pledged to fight to the death. The city was cut off from the rest, but the defenders weren't content to wait. What they did was they enticed the Spanish besiegers by taking the sacred vestments and the vessels from the churches. The Dutch were essentially Calvinistic Protestants, the Spanish were Roman Catholic. So they essentially performed blasphemy on the ramparts to try to upset the Spanish. I don't think that's the reason why they did it. When you promise to fight to the death, you have to give people a reason to die. I think the reason why they did this was to make it so that the citizens knew that if they lost, that the people would come in and massacre them because they got them mad enough. Sometimes what you wish happens, and that's what happened in Oudewater. The town was surrounded, and everything happened. The entire city, men, women, children, slaughtered. Everything was done. Eventually, the city was burned to the ground, and some citizens burned their own homes to prevent the besieging people from doing it. And the Spanish proceeded to massacre over 3/4 of the population. wiped out virtually the entire city. And they struck coins to pay the troops in there, and this is what the coins look like. You see, it's very, very crude. That was tin. They melted pieces of tin, struck the denominations on it, and it was uniface coin. We've got another siege here, Zierikzee, 1575-76. This is interesting because the city was in a position to really, really lose. And so the captain of the city had a brilliant idea. He went out to the Spanish captain and told him, you know, I think we can negotiate a surrender here, but I have to go back and talk to my people. So he went back to talk to his people. And he said, okay, he comes back out and he says, yep, I can do it. Now, we're going to go back and I will check that out and we'll do all of this. But in the meantime, he had told the people in the town to make preparations for a defense. And they worked out every little scheme and give them a practical advantage over the besieging Spaniards. So when all the plans were done, the guy from the city goes back out to them and said, I was unable to convince them, but let me go back and I think I can do it this time. He goes back and said, now come back with our terms of surrender. Goes back to the city and never returns to the ships. It was at that point that the Spanish realized they'd been tricked. And so now they know they have to conduct the siege. In the meantime, they fortified the city. They flooded the areas around the town. High water submerged most of the ramparts. It forced the captain and the ships to put troops on land. They cut them off, tried everything else. Fortunately for them, they did negotiate a surrender. It wasn't as bad as they thought, and because the city had no money, they had to pay a ransom. They paid several 100,000 guilder, and then they said, well, we can't pay 200,000 guilder. We don't have that kind of money. We'll pay you 100. So the Spanish took 100,000 and let them go. One of the negotiated ones where they kept their word, and they didn't massacre the city. Tournia, 1581. The governor of the city had an interesting wife. She hated the Spanish as much as the governor of the city, and she was a tough bird. So there was a meager garrison in there, about, I would say, a couple thousand, against an army of 21,000. And the governor, prior to the siege, had to go back to see William of Orange because he needed to get more money to fight. That left his wife in the city when the Spanish showed up. Fortunately, she was of the same mind as her husband, the governor Espinois. Her name was Christine Lelang. And if you go into Tournai, and I'll show you later, there's a statue to her, and it's absolutely fantastic. She was a very capable substitute. She had deep hatred. She handled weapons like a trained soldier. At one point, she was wounded. She was shot in the arm by a musket ball. After 10 days, she recovered after 10 days, and in spite of that, she courageously continued to fight. And there were reinforcements, and she was heroic, and Tournai, unfortunately, could not stand. So they lost. That's a picture of the coin. But, interestingly, Christine Lelang fought so well that when her troops, after they signed the treaty, marched out of the city to give it to the Spaniards cheered for her as much as the citizens of the town cheered for her bravery in attempt to save. It's rather fascinating. An absolutely, absolutely interesting lady. That's the Siege of Tournai, 1581. Pontefract's an interesting, not every siege occurred in the Netherlands, although most of these are in that particular area. Pontefract Castle was besieged in 1648. That is not what you would find there today. That's a representation of what that castle was by somebody who drew it many moons ago. Pontefract Castle has basically been done. In a surprise action, that castle was taken by parliamentary troops in June 2, 1848. Scottish royals disguised themselves as peasants and led by this man, John Morris, Colonel John Morris, they overwhelmed the defending garrison. They weren't expecting it. Shortly afterwards, Cromwell got very angry, came in, and then just kind of obliterated any of the army around Pontefract. Now, understanding in all of these sieges, when we say there's a castle, understand it's like there is a city, and in virtually every city there was some fortress that the city was built around as towns and cities developed in the Middle Ages. People migrated to the place where they could seek help. And when there were more people than would fit into a castle, the towns built up and they built walls around them. So inside cities, you would generally find a castle or a keep. And that's where these soldiers were. And they went in and took it. So in that fortress, 6,000 troops came in by Cromwell. Then, while this siege was going on, Charles I was executed. The first kind of coins, you see, Charles I had made three kind of coins. The first one is Charles I, and Charles II. Carolus Secundus on the bottom, and Charles I. Then, when Charles II died, there was another one post its execution. So they produced three very rare and very, very interesting, and I would say famous siege coins from the siege of Pontefract. But they negotiated the agreement because they said that our agreement, if you surrender, you're going to come out and you will be killed as traitors. And all the soldiers in Pontefract at that time said, if we're going to die, we're not going to die through surrender, we're going to die through fighting. And when Cromwell's forces realized that that's how they felt, they figured no more bloodshed, let's let them out on the provision that they leave and they don't fight us. Most of the negotiated agreements in all the sieges were to do that, and they were usually, I guess it's a non-disclosure agreement, or when somebody and a non-competition, because essentially, if someone leaves, for example, a business, they say you can't start up one in competition, or if in recent history in Pittsburgh we had a newscaster who left, but he wasn't allowed to be a newscaster anywhere else for at least a year. And so they do that, the non-competition agreements. And that's what happened there. So they took off. Rather interesting, but the coins are fantastic. In Groningen, 1672, very interesting, very good siege. Groningen was prepared for this siege. They destroyed all the structures outside their city. Now, the reason why, these are three medals. There are not only coins struck for the siege of Groningen, but there are medals commemorating the siege, and I collect the medals as well. These are three from my collection. As you can see, there's the city, the star-like figure, the fortress in the city. On the one side you see the wall, on the other side you see the wall, and on these medals they depict the actual positioning of the besieging troops to the city of Groningen. And that's fascinating. They found rather interesting ways to do that.
Were the medals issued contemporary or after the siege?
The medals, the question was, were the medals issued contemporary or after the siege? Actually, they were after the siege, and every siege coin was struck after the siege. It's one of those sieges, and there are one or two where they're considered siege coins because they were so contemporaneous with it that they struck coins immediately subsequent to the siege, and I have a few of those to show you there too. In order to survive, they did some creative things. Anabaptists, a very, very conservative Protestant group, some would call it a cult today. The Munster is a very interesting siege in Anabaptists, John Leiden and the Anabaptists. But Anabaptists are pacifists and they would not fight. So what the head of Groningen did was he said, since you won't fight, I'm putting you on water brigade. So because there would be a siege, he required that the houses to have buckets of water prepared in case there were fire. And the Anabaptists were charged with keeping those buckets there and having them full. And so if there were incidents of fires, the Anabaptists essentially were the firemen. They wouldn't fight, which was fair, but they would defend their property. And that was brilliant. The other brilliant thing was they used students. This is a medal, one of the medals in the series. There are several, and it commemorates a student at the University of Groningen who fought. And in fighting, they did a good job. They had all kind of things. That's attack and counterattack, as you can see there. That's another medal with both of those scenes. But Van Galen, the Bishop Van Galen, who was besieging the city, kept going. And what happened is it came in the spring, and the constant rain made it extremely difficult. And it was hard for him to besiege or to move his troops around, so he finally lifted the siege. And this is considered by most Dutch as the makings of the Netherlands. Having won this in 1672, essentially gave whatever they needed to give the sense of ethos to the Dutch people. These are the siege pieces that you will see from Groningen, the 50, 25, 12.5, and 6 1/4 stiver. All considered siege coins, but none of these were done while they were fighting. They actually were too busy fighting, and then they struck these immediately when the Van Galen and his troops left. And then, of course, they made those other medals to be commemorated and give to important people. And even some of us who would like to be important people in the 21st century have them, but we didn't earn them like those people earned those medals. See what they did with them. On the back of them, because they're unifaced, many of them were inscribed. I have a number of these myself. The coins were there, and they would inscribe it in Dutch, and that they would keep as a keepsake. Yeah.
Does that add to the value?
Does that add to the value is the question. Yes, it does, because each of them are unique. Everybody who did that. Now, I have a collection of those, and I have yet, the second one from the right, the 12.5, I have not found a 12.5 that has been inscribed. And I've been looking for one for years. But I have those. I have copies of each of the others that have inscriptions on the back in my personal collection. Even if you don't like history, the fact that these were done when they were done for the reason that they were done, the fact that someone's hand, personal hand, put that on the back of a unifaced coin is just absolutely amazing to me. And when I hold one of them, all I could say is, and in a large sense, in a lot of the siege coins, because the sieges were weird, as you hear the stories I'm telling you, but when those things were created to pay the troops, and you have one in your hand, you think, what did this see? What story could it tell? Who touched it? How did it survive? And these are, in fact, magnificent little monuments. Mayence, 1793. Very long story short, the town was surrounded. You can see that. That's what it looks like. The slide with the map. The Allied forces, predominantly Prussian, laid siege to them, several attempts. They surrounded it, and they were fighting, and they were fighting. Food became so scarce, as you can see, the river ran through the town. They would poison the dead horses, float them down the river, so that the people in the city would go to get food, eat the dead horses that were poisoned, and die. When the defenders found that out, they had to take troops off the perimeters to defend, so that they can go and keep people from eating tainted meat and dying. It was a terrible one. But 1793, that's what had happened. No relief in sight. Prussians were there. So Mayence, and you notice I have two names, Mayence and Mayence. When the French were defending the city because it was French. Once the Prussian allies took over the city, it was renamed Mayence. And so it's now Mayence, Germany, not Mayence. And it's really close by that border. 19,000 French troops marched out singing La Marseillaise with the promise that they would take their weapons, go away, and not fight for 1 year. And this one was one specifically, will not fight in that war. They could go someplace else, but they cannot fight against them. And so they did that. When the Prussian king heard that the army allowed 19,000 troops to walk out singing the French national anthem, he was furious. He called his people back and said, how could you agree to something like that? My guess is they showed some compassion. What are we going to do? Kill each other? What are we going to beat each other for another 10,000 people on either side? Probably the right thing to do. But the king hated it. Now you'd think the French would like it. Nuh-uh-uh-uh. The commanders of the French, because there were 19,000 troops left, were taken back and put on trial in Paris because they didn't fight enough. They might have had a chance. And so while they saved lives, nobody in the upper political range was satisfied. These are the coins you usually see of Mayence: the 5 sol piece, the 2 sol piece, and the 1 sol piece. You'll see those periodically for sale. What you won't see are these. And if you really want to see them, I have an exhibit over here. It's the first time I put these in public. These have been previously unknown till I discovered them several years ago, and I would guess that they were liberated from a museum sometime in the World War II. I can't be sure. But these are uncut sheets of the Siege of Mayence notes. And what they did in the beginning is they took French assignats, because they had no coin, no money in there. This is the first time, incidentally, currency was used to pay siege money. This is your first siege money in paper, legitimate currency. They took the assignats and then they wrote a new note on the back, and that's where you can see there. And that's an uncut sheet of them. Later, they could make their own. I have an uncut sheet of these as well, and they're on exhibit back there. These notes, and I was able, fortunately, to hold one up and find a watermark, research the watermark. The watermark, the people there decided to make their own currency, and this particular watermark came from Netherlands, from Dordrecht. It was a paper maker who made currency at that particular period of time in the late 1700s, and they got them to provide the paper, and they printed currency like that. And that's a 10 sol. And they were signed, and after a while you got tired signing them, they just printed them. The last siege I wanted to talk about, in the South Africa, the Boer War. That's the Boer War. That's in 1902. The Second Boer War was fought over the colonial ambitions in South Africa, of course. It pitted the British Empire against the South African Republic, in this case Transvaal, and the Orange Free State. The Boers had initial success because, as all superpowers, they go in thinking, la-di-da-di-da, we've got all of this, and they're going to capitulate. Well, the Boers didn't capitulate. The Boers did well. After losing several cities, and why you say that? Here, the Boers are on the left, the army's on the right. It's like technology difference. You know, a bunch of scattered guerrillas. Kind of like what happened in the US of A or in the Revolution. Great power, Great Britain, loses to the guerrillas and the small army of the Americans. Anyway, the British fought back with more troops to the point so their superior troops were able to overtake them. And since they were already scattered, what they did is they entertained a series of slash and burn. So they were going and they were fighting the people in guerrilla warfare, and that's the way it was. That's the way the armies are going all over the place in the South African Republic to do that. So the British methodically took portions and just employed a scorched earth policy. Okay, this prevented the Boers from fighting, because if they scorched, it was like Sherman's March to the Sea. You just destroy everything in your path so that your enemy can't use it against you. Okay, so the Boers then had to purchase provisions, and they were unable to do so in the open, so they had to purchase from all the African tribes. In order to purchase from the tribes, they wouldn't accept paper money. So they used a Pond, which is a South African Republican blank, close to the sovereign, and they minted their own. 1902, Een Pond, ZAR, Zuid-Afrika Republic, South African Republic. And that particular gold coin was used because the African didn't want anything. they had to resort to getting gold. They said they want something of substance. And when they couldn't print those, then from the back of a train, they had a little minting press, and in Macadadorp, they had blank pounds, which had a rim, and those were used because they didn't have time to stamp and create an Een Pond. And later on in Leidensburg, they did the same, only this blank has no rim. Now they're hard to authenticate. These are authentic, but there are signs, because what they did was they milled it to such a point where there's an exact weight. There's only one weight for this, and there's no change. There's no change from that. Any and all of these weigh exactly the same, and those are the cow ponds. Strangely enough, in the Siege of Mafeking, they created also notes. I have one of each of these in the exhibit over there, and that's the £1 note. And Lord Baden-Powell, the founder of the Boy Scouts, was the colonel of the Siege of Mafeking. He designed both of these notes. First, the one on the right, the 10, they were going to make a £1 note. They said it's too crude. A £1 note deserves something better. So they designed that £1 note over there, which they made. That was made because they took croquet mallets, cut them in half, and made wood blocks, and they printed these notes off of wood blocks, croquet mallets. The other one, since they didn't have printing presses, they had photographic paper. They would take the chemical that you make photographs for, put that image over top of it on clear, set it out in the sun, and they would make that. And that's why they all look blue. Light blue looks like that. It's a photograph. It's actually photographed. However, the Upington Border Scouts, that is the Border Scouts who Colonel Baden-Powell modeled the Boy Scouts from, because they were excellent out in the wilderness, they needed paid, and you couldn't get money to them. So their officers would cut pieces of canvas. That's a piece of canvas bag, a useless old canvas bag that they made a 2 shilling note from. And they also cut them out of shirts and things of that sort. So the whole issue about sieges and the stories behind them, and there are a million of them and details that I left out because I know we have limited time. These are the things that make up the context of the necessity notes. Out of necessity, all these notes, all of these coins were constructed and made, minted, printed, whatever you want to do, out of necessity. They start from coins into currency. They use every metal from gold to lead to tin to paper, then currency, and then cloth. And if you go to my exhibit, you'll note that in 1912, when the Montenegrins were coming into Albania, they used railway tickets. They printed replicas of railway tickets to pay the troops. So it's the whole story of siege money is fascinating, and I hope that you've learned a little bit from it, or got a little bit, sparked a little of your interest. 2 things I want to say. This is the book that I just recently published on siege coins. Came out in July of this year, published by Classical Numismatic Group. It's an English thing on siege coins and contains a narrative. As I started, the most important thing is not just a list of coins, but a narrative of where they came from and why they have meaning. And that's where I got this. This is all from my research and stuff. Secondly, if you are not a member of the ANA and you want to be a member of the ANA is offering a 1-year membership that is digital membership, and it's $5. If any of you want this, fill out one of these and I will pay the $5. I'm a district representative for the ANA, and I like to promote membership. So what I'd like you to do it. I'd be more than happy to have you send your name in, and I'd be even more than happy to pay the $5 to give you a year's membership, okay? That's what we have here. If you're interested in the book, I will be over at the John Burns Library, and I'll be able to sign any copies that you might want, okay? Thank you very much for listening.
Dr. Korchnak, on behalf of PAN, I'd like to thank you for the information and what you provided for us, and certainly good luck on the book, and I hope all of you go over and talk Doctor a little bit more, and thanks again for being part of PAN.
No, thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Larry.
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Tom.